Which props should you bet on this Sunday? What's going on, football fans and gridiron gamblers? It's Mitch here with your NFL Week 6 player props. How this video works is I combine my knowledge of the NFL, this week's matchups, and of course, Outlier and the trends across the NFL to identify the best player props to pick for Week 6 of the 2024 NFL season. If that sounds good, we make this video every single week on the BLV, so don't forget to subscribe, spike the like button, and if you're curious about more props and more bets, you can find all of my real bets that I place my real money on to help you also make some money on Patreon. That link is in the description. I'll put it at the pinned comment if you want to check out what I'm betting this Sunday, including the player props that I'm betting. In this video, I'm going to provide over 20 player props from the London game all the way through to the afternoon slate. Any Sunday night or Monday night football action will be exclusive to Patreon. So let's get started, guys, and don't forget to comment your favorite prop from Week 6, the Sunday slate. Let me know your favorite prop and your favorite pick, and if you have any questions at all, just let me know, and I'll try to give you my best analysis possible. Let's get started, guys, with the first player prop of Week 6, and that is Christian Kirk, an old reliable, over 19.5 as his longest reception. This is called a trend. This is called a trend. As you guys can see, Christian Kirk has exceeded 19.5 as his longest reception in 15 of his last 16 games. Not 15 of his last 16 games against the Bears, or games on the road, or games in London, or games at home. No. 15 of his last 16 games. His average is 31.9 yards per reception on average as his longest reception. That's the average of his longest reception. Obviously not every reception, okay? That's not his average. But 94% of the time, this bet is hitting, and it's at minus 106. So this is just one of those that, based on the odds, 94% of the time, this is a phenomenal bet. So if you want to bet something small on the London game and you don't want to play the spread, you don't want to play the total, which I don't blame you whatsoever, guys, you should be betting on Christian Kirk because it feels like the guy just always goes over this number. Plus, Trevor Lawrence loves throwing the ball down the field. And if I were to say the weakest point on the Bears secondary from a schematical personnel standpoint would definitely be in the middle of the field, would definitely be at nickel as opposed to the outside perimeter options. Stevenson is a physical big corner, and then Jalen Johnson's one of the best in the game, and I would say that Gordon would be the guy, or just the middle of the field in general would be the area to target, which is where Christian Kirk primarily lines up. He is a vertical slot receiver, which is why you can get his number at 19.5. So we've got a lot more London to get to, and I'm probably going to place a few of these myself because I think there's a lot of action for the London game, specifically with Jacksonville, but we'll get to a couple with Chicago as well. So next up, we have Trevor Lawrence going under 243.5 total yards. Now, this is sort of contradictory to the Christian Kirk longest reception because obviously the more yards Lawrence gets, the more opportunity for Kirk to go over his longest reception. But again, longest reception is just one catch, right? So keep that in mind. And under 242 or 243 would be the call here at minus 114. That's the price. Trevor Lawrence has failed to exceed 242.5 pass plus rush yards in 4 of his last 5 games on the road. He averages 211 pass and rush yards on a game average. That's 80% in the last 5 games. So when you take a look, right, Houston, he's struggled to put up yardage in Houston, 174 yards. Buffalo, only 181. He was actually pulled out of that game. Miami, week 1, 170. So we already have a sample size of 3 games in 2024. The last time he went over this number was actually last season. So that's also a pretty good trend for us because we've seen 3 games already go well below this number. It's 242.5. He hasn't really been running the ball a lot either, right? So 170, 181, 174, that's not even close. Like, that's not even within like 60 yards. So yeah, like, this feels pretty good to me because Chicago has a very good defense. They're top 10, in my opinion, in the NFL. They're top 10 against the pass. They have a solid pass rush. Lawrence has been pretty inaccurate and all over the place. And I don't think he's really been running as much as people would think he is. Plus, the Bears have a pretty decent athletic front, including Montez Sweat, who can run down pretty much any quarterback in football. So if he does decide to run, I don't think they're going to lose containment all that much. So 243.5 under for Lawrence. I expect them to actually hit the ground. One trend or one bet that I also don't mind here for Lawrence is another under, which is, I'm just trying to find it to see if they have it here. They had it earlier when I was looking at it, but the trend is under 22.5 completions. That would be another bet that I would make against Lawrence in this game. So the bet for this purpose of the video is under 242.5 or 243.5, depending on which number you get. But also the completions under is also a look as well. Next up, we're going to look to the Bears with DJ Moore, over 64.5 receiving yards. He has actually exceeded this in 4 of his last 5 games against bottom 10 defenses in the NFL against receivers, which Jacksonville certainly qualifies for that. Jacksonville has been atrocious against receivers this year. They were horrible against the Colts. I mean, Pierce and Downs both had like pretty much career games or close to it. DJ Moore has had a couple good games with Caleb Williams. Last week was his best, and they're carrying that momentum into a matchup where they're playing one of the weakest, if not the weakest, pass defense in football. What I specifically like from a matchup standpoint for DJ Moore is he is a good route runner. He's a guy that can beat you at all 3 levels, and Jacksonville plays a lot of man coverage. DJ Moore is a good route runner, a great athlete. He's very, very smooth in terms of his ability to change gears in his speed and then get by you down the field. DJ Moore is less of a zone beater and more of a man torcher, and that's why I think that he really matches up against Jacksonville very well. So you look at this trend, 78 yards against the Colts, who we brought up the Colts earlier. The only time he went under here is Green Bay last season. Now, obviously, he hasn't played very much against bottom 10 defenses, but the one time that he did go over this number this season. So that's obviously good for us. 78 yards against the Colts. And then he also had a really good game last week, which he did go over 64.5 yards. So yeah, DJ Moore, just a really good football player. I think Caleb will be looking him to torch man coverage consistently in this game in London. Next up, we've got some Tank Bigsby props. I like a couple different Tank Bigsby props. I think, first of all, Tank Bigsby is extremely underrated. That's first and foremost. Secondly, he's arguably the best running back on Jacksonville. And third, as I brought up, I think that the Jags will be leaning on the run because Chicago is way better against the pass than they are against the run, which is where I would correlate Trevor Lawrence going under passing yards, under total yards, and Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne also potentially going over their numbers. But the one that I like more is Tank Bigsby. Now, the trends do suggest that he has failed to exceed 13.5 longest rushing yards in 16 of his last 19. Now, that's because he was a backup and pretty much a handcuff for Travis Etienne last year. But if you look closer at this trend and we pull it up, 13.5 as his longest rush, he's actually gone over this number 3 times this season. So 3 out of 5 games, he's gone over this number. And the 2 times he didn't, he really didn't play very much at all. He basically didn't play against Cleveland, and then he only had a 7 longest rush against Buffalo in a game in which they were getting absolutely annihilated and they weren't running the ball. So in the games that he actually did play, he's gone over this number substantially 3 times this year. 26 yards was his longest rush against Miami, 58 against the Texans, and 65 against the Colts. Bigsby is an explosive player. He's got good speed and good power. I'd expect him to hit the over longest rush, which is plus 100 at DraftKings. You also have his potential for going just over his rushing total. His rushing total is 39.5, which again, it says that he has failed to exceed 39.5 rushing yards in 16 of his last 19, which is what Outlier suggests. But again, they show you where he has failed and where he's succeeded, right? In terms of this trend. Now, he's gone over this number clearly 3 times this year in the games in which he actually got the ball and actually played without injury. He had 101 yards against the Colts last week. He had 90 yards the week before that. So even just looking at the last 2 games, he's gone way over this number. And like I said, I think Chicago is a team that you can run on and not necessarily throw on. So I think Tank Bigsby is a great bet if you're looking to bet the Jags and looking to bet London. And lastly, for the London game, we have DeAndre Swift going over his receiving yards at 19.5. He's been a pretty good weapon in the screen game for Chicago. He's a very good screen back. He's very good at finding that little crease to be able to explode through, get his blocks and work off his blocks, as well as that quickness, that explosion once he gets that football. Swift has exceeded 19.5 receiving yards in 5 of his last 6 overall games. That's 83% of the time. Now, when we look at it this season, he has actually gone over every single game except for week 1, in which he had 0 receiving yards against Tennessee. But ever since that disastrous offensive performance against the Titans, he put up 24, 22, 72, and 47. And if you even look at the last 2 games, he's been featured as a receiving weapon against the Rams with 72 yards and 47 yards against Carolina. So he does play a better defense here against the pass for sure, but 19.5 for a guy that's as explosive in space as Swift in the screen game, I think they'll definitely feature him, especially early in the game when they want to get Caleb comfortable in kind of a weird environment in London. Let's move towards the first window of games on Sunday after the London game, and we're going to start off with Jerome Ford going under his longest reception of 11.5. The Eagles' defense isn't fantastic, and I don't necessarily love their linebackers or anything. This is more of a fade of the Browns. Jerome Ford has failed to exceed 11.5 as his longest reception in 5 of his last 6 games on the road. 7.3 his longest reception game average. So Washington last week, awful. 7 was his longest reception. 9 against the Raiders, which I think was the week before that, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it was based on the dates. And then Jacksonville, they've already played 3 games this year on the road. And all 3 of them have not only been under 11.5, but actually under 10 yards for his longest reception. So Deshaun Watson's awful. I really don't expect any success from Deshaun Watson against really anybody. So I'm going to go with Ford to go under. Plus, Watson will usually just run or usually look down the field for a more explosive gain rather than dump it off to his running back. So the only way that he really goes over, in my opinion, this longest reception at minus 119 is a screen. That's probably the only way that it works. We're going to look at Derrick Henry as we've been looking at each and every week on the channel, and he's pretty much been cashed the entire season. I would look at his rushing attempts going over. He's gone over this number 17.5 in 7 of his last 8 games at home. Now, this obviously includes games in Tennessee as well as in Baltimore, but we have seen Baltimore play at home this year. So we've seen him go over this number quite a bit. But I would say that Washington is a game that I think a lot of people may believe will be close, but I actually get the sense that Baltimore will be up late in this game, which I think only incentivizes Baltimore to finish this game hard with a lot of attempts to their big back, Derrick Henry. And controlling this game and keeping the ball away from Jaden Daniels is not a bad idea. So he had 24 attempts against the Bills. He had 18 against the Raiders in a game in which they were up for a majority of the game, but they ended up losing the lead. And then you look at his Titans days, which he pretty much always went over this prop. But so far, he's 2 for 2 at home as a Raven, over 17.5. That's not a bad one. Obviously, you can always look towards him scoring a touchdown. Now, this 193 is not exactly an ideal bet, though. You're going to have to combine that, throw that in a parlay if you really want that. But 6 of his last 7 home games, he's hit that. His longest rush is not a bad idea either. He's exceeded this in 5 of his last 6 games at 17.5. Washington is not a terrible run defense, but there's certainly nothing to really be scared of. And then 69.5 rushing yards is also not a bad idea. Henry has gone over this number 9 of his last 10 games at home, no matter which team he's been on. He averages 103 yards at home in his last 10 games. So Derrick Henry is a good bet this week in a game where I feel like a lot of people think it's going to be a shootout, but I could see the Ravens getting up early and sustaining a lead throughout. Although I'm not saying that Washington has no chance. They definitely do. I just think that the Ravens should control this game. I kind of see it going like the Lions game last year, where the Ravens kind of blew them out despite everybody kind of loving the Lions last year. So I kind of see it being a down spot for the Commanders. That's just my opinion, though. Next up, the Colts, Trey Surman. I would fade Trey Surman this week. He's playing the Tennessee Titans defense that I think might be the most underrated defense in the NFL. Surman, I would go under 51.5 rushing yards. He has failed to exceed this in 8 straight games on the road. Obviously, he's been primarily a backup, so I'm just throwing that trend out there, but it doesn't mean too much, I would say. He has also failed to exceed half a rushing touchdown in 16 of his last 18 games, which at least provides a substantial kind of size for us to kind of see that he doesn't score a lot of touchdowns, no matter like what position he's been in. So I would probably look to just play the under 51.5. He did get the start against Jacksonville last week, and he only rushed for 38 yards, which is something to look at. And I think Tennessee's run defense with Jeff Simmons in there is just as capable, if not better, than Jacksonville's. So I would fade Trey Surman. I'm just not a huge believer in him. He's maybe a usable player in fantasy if you had Jonathan Taylor and things like that, but I would fade him against a good defense. Next up, we've got James Conner, who I never fade. James Conner is an absolute stud, and I love James Conner. But there are a couple things that I like about James Conner. I think the one that I like the most is I like the longest rush, exceeding 15.5 longest rush in 8 of his last 10 games, which is 80% on a 10-game sample size, which is pretty solid. That's 22.3 is his longest rush average. He actually failed to do this against San Francisco, which was surprising. But I think he would do this against Green Bay, a run defense that's pretty shaky and up and down. I would also say that I love the over his total yards, 84.5, which is the one that I wanted to place in this video. He has gone over this in 8 of his last 10 overall games. He's been an absolute machine with Kyler Murray as his quarterback. 108.8 total yards per game on average in his last 10 games. The only time he did not do this was against the Buffalo Bills and against the Detroit Lions. 2 pretty legit defenses. This game against the Packers could be kind of like the Niners game where maybe they fall behind early, but they come back or like make it interesting near the end. It could also just be a straight up shootout in which I would just want to have Conner in any sort of prop, period. I also don't hate him scoring a touchdown in this game. I mean, damn, he had 204 yards against the Seahawks last year in a single game. So this guy's consistently been hitting almost 100 yards a game. I mean, you look at 100 yards against Pittsburgh, 112 yards against Chicago, 133 against Philly, 200 against the Seahawks, 124 against the Rams, 113 against the Commanders, 100 against the Niners. So you might even be able to play some sort of alternate receiving rush total where maybe you do like over 90 yards because it feels like he goes to 100 pretty much every time he goes over this number. So I would potentially look at that for James Conner. Next up, we're going to take a look at some Jordan Love. Jordan Love, I like overall the touchdowns. I think for quarterbacks, he overall has one of the better prices for over 1.5 touchdowns. Usually it's kind of hard to get a good over on a passing touchdown prop, but Jordan Love has pretty consistently gone over this number. I mean, he's hit this in 9 straight games, guys. 9 straight, which is absolutely outrageous that he's gone over 1.5 touchdowns. He's facing one of the weakest defenses, one of the weakest secondaries in all of football. And he's hit this 9 straight times and is only minus 137. So I don't think the market has necessarily caught up to Jordan Love yet at 1.5. I mean, he's thrown 2 touchdowns against, look at how far this dates back. This dates back to early December against the Bucs, and this goes all the way through the playoffs. So it goes Tampa Bay 2, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 2, 4, 2. And this season, he's also, been able to hit this 3 times. in all 3 games. So I think he's pretty much a lock for 2 passing touchdowns, especially if Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs play. That only incentivized the Packers to throw the ball. So Jordan Love at minus 137, which isn't actually like a great price for most props, but for this prop, it feels like a lock. So I would go over Jordan Love there and maybe even make him a staple of your parlay if you want to do like multiple quarterbacks over 1.5 touchdowns, something like that. DeAndre Hopkins over his receiving yards of 41.5. Hopkins has exceeded 41.5 in 4 of his last 5 games against bottom 10 defenses. Now, he did this against Green Bay this season, which was kind of like his breakout game this year in terms of his connection with Will Levis. Now, the reason I like this is less because of the trend and more because of I like how D-Hop has looked recently. I think he's looked healthier. I also think that the Colts are absolutely dreadful against the pass. And I do believe Will Levis will have success in this game. I know that Will Levis is not the greatest quarterback, and a lot of people don't think he's very good, and that's fine. I don't think he's great either. But I do think that he is a downfield passer, and he's going to look to throw the ball downfield. And it is a great objective matchup for this football team and for this passing game. So I would argue that D-Hop has kind of been still their number 1 receiver this year, despite them signing Calvin Ridley. So to get a number 1 receiver against arguably the worst secondary in the NFL at 41.5 receiving yards is not a bad shout. So it's minus 110. Next up, we've got Lamar Jackson with our go-to longest rush at over 16.5. Again, still haven't adjusted to this at minus 105. Lamar has hit this in 8 of his last 10 games. We bet this last week, and he went over it at 18. This was also featured in the video last week. 16.5, he went over it with 18. Now, the only times he hasn't gone over this was against Dallas, where he basically just handed the ball off the entire game, and then against the Chiefs in the AFC Championship. Otherwise, he's gone over this in 8 of his last 10, which is 80% in a large sample size. And on average, he goes over 16.5 by 4 yards at 20.7 being his rush per game average. So Lamar Jackson over 16.5 as his longest rush. Now we are going to get Baker on his longest rush as well. And Baker has sneakily been running the ball really well this year. So I want to kind of play into that. Baker has exceeded 8.5 as his longest rush in 6 of his last 7 overall games, averaging 10.6 as his longest rush per game average. That's 86% in his last 7 games. Now, he went over this against Atlanta, 18. He went over this against the Eagles, 10. He didn't actually run at all against the Broncos, so he had 0. And then Detroit this year, again, 12. And then Washington this year, 11. So just this season alone, he's gone over this 4 out of the last 5 games. So that's pretty good. That's 80% that he's going over 8.5. Then you combine, did you watch Mahomes against the Saints last week? I mean, the Saints defensive line looks slow. They can't run. They're not very athletic. So I think Baker can escape a few times and make like a 10-yard scramble for a first down. So I would play Baker as well as Lamar over their longest rush at the quarterback position. Devonte Smith, I like him in this game against Cleveland to go over 57.5. Devonte Smith is back. He's healthy, and I think he's probably healthier than A.J. Brown, so that does play a role into this. But also, Martin Emerson has been absolutely atrocious this year at allowing big gains. If Denzel Ward is defending A.J. Brown a majority of the time in man coverage, I think that Smith will draw rather Emerson or Newsome, and I think that's a matchup for him in this game. So I like him to go over 57.5 and for Jalen Hurts to find him down the field a few times. He has gone over this in 5 of his last 6 games at home and tends to play better in Philadelphia. He has also averaged 78.5 receiving yards at home compared to the total right now, which is 57.5. So that's 21 total yards on average that he exceeds this number. So 83% Devonte Smith is going over 57.5. Jaden Reed. I love how Jaden Reed has been playing, and Jordan Love has been very inaccurate this year, very inconsistent, but one thing that he's been consistent with is throwing to Jaden Reed for big plays. So Jaden Reed, his longest reception is at 24.5, and he has actually exceeded this in 5 of his last 6 games, averaging 38.5 as his longest reception. I just expect them to hit one big post or one big crosser in this game. It's against an Arizona defense that I don't have much faith in. I don't think they're very good. I don't think their pass rush is very good. They didn't look good against the Niners last week. So they provide the quarterback a lot of extra time to find a big lane down the field, a big throw down the field. And so I think that Reed will be able to get behind the defense rather on a play action crosser, a deep post, something, or he's just really good with the ball in his hand, so he could just make something happen, just by himself. So Jaden Reed over 24.5. Will Levis. We brought up Will Levis already, so I'll keep this brief, but I like his over total yards, passing and rushing, over 199.5. I like the total yards because he's been better going over total yards than actually just passing yards, because Will Levis is a sneaky runner of the football as well. He has exceeded 213.5 passing and rushing yards. This is at 199, by the way. He's exceeded 213 4 of his last 5 games at home. He's had 227 per game average. This is at minus 166, so it's not the best odds overall. Maybe you could perhaps find an alternate line, maybe even go over like 230 or something like that, and you should find better odds for Will Levis. But like I said, if you like D-Hop, if you like the Titans in this game, if you think the Colts secondary sucks, which you should, then you should play Will Levis overs. I do agree with that. Now let's get to the afternoon. I've got 5 different props that I like for the afternoon, mostly centering around the Detroit Lions running game. So David Montgomery, who is the thumbnail for this video, I like David Montgomery pretty much going over everything. So Montgomery over his rushing yards at only 58.5. He has gone over this number 4 of his last 5 games on the road. Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think that the Lions tend to go with Montgomery on the road more often than Gibbs, because Montgomery is more of a trustworthy running back, as well as the fact that he is a bigger, more powerful grinder of a running back, which I think sets a tone for their football team. So I think there is something to playing on the road with Montgomery as well, as opposed to Gibbs. But I would say that 76.8 rushing yards per game average, that's almost 20 yards on average over this 58.5. The Cowboys' run defense is weak. They've been ran on all year pretty much, and I think the Lions, that will be their primary goal and game plan. So I expect both these running backs to get a ton of work. I also like him to exceed his longest rush of 12.5. He's done this in 6 of his last 7 road games, averaging 23.7 as his longest rush on the road. You could also go with a touchdown here. Montgomery has exceeded half a touchdown in 6 straight games versus bottom 10 defenses. That's a 100% hit rate at minus 137 on Prize Picks. And then again, like attempts, 5 of the last 6 games on the road, over 13.5 rush attempts. My favorites, though, I would say are the top 3. Rushing yards, just in general, longest rush, and touchdown. I would all be into those. Next up, we've got Jameson Williams of the Lions going over 20.5 as his longest reception. With the Lions running the ball a lot, there will be shot plays to be had down the field. I do think personally that Jameson Williams is a mismatch for this Cowboys secondary, because this Cowboys secondary is tall, they're long, but they're not very fast. I think Williams will give them a double move or a route that they just can't stick with. And I think Williams in open space as well will make them pay for a big play. So he went over this, pretty consistently lately. 5 of his last 6 games, 37.8 longest reception game average. That is 83%. Now he went over this against the Seahawks with a 70-yard touchdown. He only had a 9-yard catch against Arizona, but other than that, 50 against Tampa, 52 against the Rams in the opener. So 3 out of the last 4 games, he has done this. So I like Jameson Williams because of the matchup in this one to be able to get down the field. I expect him, just like Reed, he's very similar that way. They always run these big, deep dig routes, big, deep crossing routes. He goes from the left all the way across the field. They always try to find a shot play to him. So I like Jameson Williams over 20.5. Jake Ferguson, I just think, is an underrated player. He just consistently goes over his props every single week. I think he'll go over 48.5 receiving yards. He's done this 4 out of the last 5 games against bottom 10 defenses for receiving yards allowed. He averages 77 yards pretty much, 76.8 receiving yards per game. So He did this against Baltimore, 95. He did this against Green Bay, 93 last year. And he's gone over this number just in general. I don't know if we could find so he went over against Pittsburgh, 70. He went over against the Giants, barely, but he did, 49. So the only time this season that he didn't go over was the game that he got hurt. He didn't play against Cleveland, and he didn't play the week after. But once he returned against Baltimore, he went over. So the last 3 games, he's gotten over 48.5. If this game's a shootout or the lines are putting up points, that just means Ferguson's going to get a ton of volume at the end of this game. And he's now the number 2 receiver in this offense because Cooks is hurt. So Ferguson's going to get fed. Jahmyr Gibbs, we brought up Montgomery. I like Gibbs to score a touchdown probably more than Montgomery. I would combine Montgomery yards with a Gibbs touchdown. Gibbs seems to be their guy right now, scoring touchdowns he just feels like it. 7 of the last 8 total games, he's scored a touchdown at -120 on DraftKings. You can also go with him to exceed his longest rush of 14.5, which he has done in 8 straight games on the road, 100% hit rate at -120 on Underdog. So, I like the touchdown. I like the longest rush for Jahmyr Gibbs. I think they're going to run all over Dallas, and I think Gibbs will probably get at least 1 touchdown. Both these running backs might get a touchdown. I don't know if there's a parlay for that or like if there's boosted odds for that, but I think there's likely that they both get a touchdown. And then we're going to finish it off with Dak Prescott. Remember, guys, all the primetime props that I'm actually betting, I will give out all the primetime props on my Patreon, the ones that I think are most advantageous, as well as the ones that I'm actually going to bet. So if you want to sign up to Patreon, link in the description, link in the pinned comment. But Dak Prescott, you could go with an interception here. He's actually hit an interception, -137 on Prize Picks against top 10 defenses 5 straight games. But I don't usually love playing interceptions because I think they're kind of fluky. So what I prefer is I actually prefer something with his attempts. He's actually been very, very good at home. So you could go over his yardage if you think this will be a shootout. You could go over 279.5 total yards. He's done this 8 of his last 9 games at home. If you think that the Cowboys will be able to keep up, or if you think they'll be trailing the entire game, you could play the over passing yards. That's at -115, which is a pretty good price. His total yardage prop of 293, I'd probably just play the pass yards, is -114. But I like the attempts. I think he's going to exceed his attempts of 37.5. He's done this 5 of the last 6 games against bottom 10 defenses for passing attempts against. And Detroit allows a lot of passing attempts because they're such a good run defense. A lot of teams know this, so they just ramp up their pass volume. Plus, they're usually in the lead. So usually when they're in the lead, they're able to, give up a lot of passing attempts. So, Dak Prescott over 37.5 passing attempts. He actually averages 43.5 in these type of games. So 51 attempts against Baltimore, 39 attempts against New Orleans, 60 attempts against Green Bay. Those were the last 3 times that happened. So there you guys go. Those are the props for week 6. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know in the comments if you enjoy these prop videos. Don't forget to sign up to Patreon. It's Mitch of the BLV. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Deuces.